in some respects, there wasn't any need to address that issue. Also, of course, the problem of what I call the moving goalposts, because what it means to be fully vaccinated seems to be changing. And I like what Abraham Hamilton said last hour, maybe even changing as we talk. Let's hope not, but who knows there. And then if you go to the third page, you can read it in its entirety. But he talks about, first of all, the mandate is not necessary in the emergency sense of that. Second, OSHA failed to establish that COVID poses a grave danger, and OSHA's authority, number three, is confined to the walls of the workplace. And, of course, the stretch to try to say that this applies to such things as a virus may be really a very significant stretch, and we'll see how the court rules. Recognize that I am not convinced that the court is a 6-3 court or even a 5-4 court. I am convinced it's a 3-3-3 court. You have three justices. We know who those are. They always vote against Donald Trump and for Joe Biden, and it just is as obvious as it can be. You have three conservatives who generally hold to the Constitution, although we have even some exceptions amongst them. And then you have the three in the middle, and that would be the Chief Justice and the two most recent appointees to the Supreme Court that sometimes move back and forth. So we'll see where it goes. But I, just before we take a break, wanted to give you an update on the Navy SEALs. And that is the other article we've posted. This is a press release, and I've also posted an article from the Daily Wire. And it was kind of interesting because on Friday we were talking with Lathan Watts, and at one point there was kind of a counterpoint a little bit between Penna and Lathan. I kind of got a kick out of that because Penna was saying, I was talking about how if you listen to Point of View, you hear about what's going on in these First Liberty cases, and Penna jumped in to, certainly say to our friends at Fox News that they cover the cases too. But Lathan wasn't going to let that sit because he came back and said, some on air and a lot off air, there is a real difference. Fox will talk about the story, but they will never tell you what happened to the end of the story. And we do tell you the rest of the story. And also, as illustrated by one of the articles I've posted here from the Daily Wire, it goes through this entire story talking about this particular victory, an injunction, at least on behalf of the Navy SEALs, and never mentions First Liberty Institute. So not only do we tell you actually how the case came out, we also tell you who fought the case in the first place. And so there's something to be said about that. But here is what is actually coming down, and that is the U.S. District Court in the Northern District of Texas, due to the Judge Reed O'Connor, ruled indeed that Navy service members in this case seek to vindicate the very freedoms they have sacrificed so much to protect. Again, I'm quoting from him. He said, the COVID-19 pandemic provides the government no license to abrogate those freedoms. There is no COVID-19 exception to the First Amendment. There is no military exclusion from our Constitution. 3 cheers for Judge Reed O'Connor there in Fort Worth. And Michael Berry's been on the program with us. He's general counsel for First Liberty and deals with the part of First Liberty dealing with the military. He said, forcing a service member to choose between their faith and serving their country is abhorrent to the Constitution and America's values. He went on to say, punishing SEALs for simply asking for a religious accommodation is purely vindictive and punitive. We're pleased that the court has acted to protect our brave warriors before more damage is done to our national security. Now, the question you probably are going to ask, it's the one my wife asked when we were walking down the road and first heard about this, is, well, will it be appealed? And the answer is, of course, it will be appealed, and we'll see where it goes. But at least at the moment, we're not going to be throwing the Navy SEALs out on the pavement, and we won't be taking their Navy SEAL trident off of their uniform, and we won't be actually persecuting them and even maybe taking them to court and forcing them to pay back the actual money spent in training them in the first place. And I think that's good news. Wouldn't you say so? It's a victory for First Liberty, and if you've heard about it here first at Point of View, maybe that's why you need to listen to Point of View. When we come back, let's get into this poll that wasn't a poll by The Guardian, a poll that never happened in Gallup, and a couple other stories that you need to hear about right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Charles Cook tells a story about a friend who was taken on his 18th birthday and forced to take out $70,000 in student loans and then forced to go to college. At the end, he complained about having to pay back that student loan. He was, of course, kidding about the story that he used to explain how some college graduates and some politicians make it seem like student loan debt was extracted at the point of a gun. The current demand for the federal government to pay off student loans has been increasing. That is why he wrote a column about it. The current argument goes something like this. If I didn't have to pay my loans, I'd have more money to spend on consumer products, which would have a beneficial macroeconomic effect. Another line is, if I didn't have to repay my loans, I could get on the property ladder. He counters by using the same argument for other working people. For example, if I didn't have to pay my mortgage, I'd have more money to spend on consumer products, which would have a beneficial macroeconomic effect. Here's another justification. If my plumber didn't have to make the payments on the F-150 he uses to transport his equipment, he would be more readily able to buy a home. The possible response to such counter-arguments might be that student loan debt is different. But is it any different? You might argue that going to college benefits society, but that's a debatable point. And think of the benefit to society coming from working people who never went to college but perform needed services. He concludes by quoting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who argues that her $17,000 in student loan debt is unacceptable. This claim coming from a member of Congress who makes $175,000 a year and recently bought a Tesla. Here's an idea. Pay off your debts like everyone else. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I thought for just a minute I would come back to a story that we talked about on Friday. It wasn't correct, and I'm always quite willing to correct any mistakes that we make here. We were going on some of the material that came from our friends at American Spectator, which is a very reliable outfit, but nevertheless turned out not to be quite the case. And it turns out that, as you may know, Time Magazine for many years has had its Man of the Year, then Person of the Year, and whatever. And so the Person of the Year for Time Magazine was Elon Musk. By the way, if you haven't watched, and maybe I should before we end the program today, give you a little bit of the back and forth that's going on between Elon Musk and Senator Elizabeth Warren. It is comical, but nevertheless, we'll go on. But when Elon Musk was picked as the Person of the Year, Guardian, which is a newspaper in England, in the UK, posted an article on the website, and then they thought, okay, just as a maybe thought experiment, who would you, as the readers of The Guardian, nominate as your Person of the Year, and said that they would publish some of those. So then, on the 30th of December, they did that, but it looked as if they weren't going to release the poll because it was obviously one in which J.K. Rowling, who is best known of Harry Potter fame, came in first. Now, the argument that we made at the time, and the argument being made by one of the columnists at the American Spectator, was that because she has said some things that would be perceived as anti-trans, because she's a feminist, she was simply asserting obvious things, and she's been, criticized quite a bit. That was the assumption being made. Now, to be fair, The Guardian then came back and said, contrary to what you may have read on Twitter, there was no poll, and The Guardian does not run a Person of the Year feature. Nothing has been canceled. We regularly invite readers to share their views on issues in the news. So, in some respects, you can say, all right, they really didn't intend that to be a poll. They just wanted to see who you would nominate. And to be fair, let me read one that appeared in The Guardian, just so you can hear what was said. One individual said, J.K. Rowling, this is Michelle, by the way, from Wiltshire, there in England, a superb writer, and it's her way of writing that still and has to encourage children to read. Despite having experienced domestic abuse in her personal life, she uses her experiences and voice to center women and children so that a wide audience is aware of their vulnerabilities children and women can face in today's society. She donates to charities, so is aware of her hard-earned position and wants to give back to those in need. She's a very inspiring for women and is supportive of women's rights despite people trying to drag her down. So anyway, the bottom line is that we made it sound, because that was what we were working on, that indeed Guardian pulled down the poll. That was the quote that was in Spectator. Turns out it wasn't a poll, but it was eliciting a response. And I think it does illustrate again that here is an individual that would have been at the top of the media elite's list until she said some very obvious things, not from a Christian point of view, but really from a feminist point of view, about the trans issue, and nevertheless got herself in some hot water with that. And so that, I think, illustrates the point. Well, the people that have been watching these polls notice something very unique. That is, every year, Time Magazine has its Person of the Year, and every year, but not this year, Gallup had a poll for the most admired man in America. Now, the most admired woman in America, sometimes it's been Mother Teresa, but most of the time it's been the First Lady. So it's Michelle Obama. Well, of course, it was never Mrs. Trump, but it, of course, as or it was Hillary Clinton, whoever it was. Anyway, they have done this from 1946 to 2020. There was one year in 1976 where it was skipped for some reason I don't know. But it turns out that a year ago, Gallup actually had to admit that Donald Trump edged out Barack Obama in first place. And so everybody was wondering, well, what in the world would the Gallup poll do this year? And the answer is, well, we no longer have a Gallup annual poll for the most admired man, fearing that even after, of course, we're going to be talking about this, January 6th, Donald Trump still might end up being the most admired individual. And I will be talking about that in just a minute because it gets into our last article that we have here as well. But I thought while we're talking about political leaders, for those of you that are in the East Coast right now, there is quite a bit of ice and snow. Now, I know our listeners up in Alaska are smiling at this, but nevertheless, if you are trying to drive down Interstate 95, and I've driven there many times in the past, it has taken people hours and hours to just go a few miles because of all the things that are happening. Well, what has been so interesting, and here's a good example of people making a mistake, the Twitter accounts have just exploded, especially in places around Virginia, complaining that the newly elected governor, that would be Glenn Youngkin, actually should be doing something about this issue. One of the interviews we've had on this program, by the way, is a conservative, and we've certainly appreciated them. Jonah Goldberg said, if I were Glenn Youngkin, I'd be flooding the zone to get this I-95, uses a four-letter word I can't use, fixed. D.C. suburbs are vengeful about this kind of thing. Of course, people pointed out to Jonah Goldberg and some of the others I'm going to quote in just a minute, Glenn Youngkin is the incoming governor of the state of Virginia, but he's not sworn in till January 15th. If you look at your calendar, that's still 11 days away. Another individual, John Peter Zinger, has nearly 5,000 followers, went off on Youngkin, saying some things like, what's happening on the highways in Virginia is tragic. Problem is Governor Youngkin has no experience in governing. That's what happens when voters fall for critical race theory dog whistles. You should have stuck with McAuliffe. That'd be Terry McAuliffe. But again, the incoming governor is Glenn Youngkin, but he's not governor yet. It's Terry McAuliffe who is the case. And then one other, Jennifer G. Looks Youngkin failed his first test in Virginia with traffic stop for 10 to 12 hours on 95 in Virginia. Failure for government. And again, all sorts of people erroneously, so I guess we're not the only one that makes mistakes, claiming that he made a mistake when he's still just not the governor. Just as we take a break, let me mention that my commentary today is about the student loan debt. The reason I brought it up is, first of all, the decision was made the other day by President Biden to once again postpone payments for the student loan debt. And I quote from a very good piece by Charles Cook, who points out that this demand that individuals pay for their student loans is usually following this kind of argument like, if I didn't have to pay my student loans, I'd have more money to spend on consumer products, which would have a beneficial macroeconomic effect. If I didn't have to repay my loans, I could get on the property ladder. And of course, he says, you could use that the other way around. If I didn't have to pay my mortgage, I'd have more money to spend on consumer products, and that would help the macroeconomic effect. Or if my plumber didn't have to make payments on his Ford F-150 he uses to transport his equipment, he would be more readily able to buy a home. But the argument was one that Charles Cook focused on one individual, because you have a member of Congress, and her name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who argues that she should not have to pay her $17,000 student loan debt. She says that is unacceptable. Well, then who does? Well, all the individuals that didn't go to college have to pay for it then if she doesn't pay for it, because somebody gets to pay for it. And, of course, we point out that not only is she a member of Congress making $175,000 a year, but she recently bought a Tesla. And if you go to the website right now, you will see that, thank you, Karen, she found a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Tesla. A nice-looking car, by the way. It's amazing when you got that kind of money, what kind of car you can drive around here. So anyway, wanted you to know that that has been posted on the website, and you can read it. And if you find yourself somebody maybe complaining about student loan debt or something else, I thought I'd give you a couple of key talking points. But again, nobody's having to pay at least anything right now, principal or interest on their student loan, because it's been postponed by the president, which again, as we've talked about with some of these other actions, I think is unconstitutional, but there you go. Let's, if we can, in this last half hour, talk about the biggest political takeaways. Some of that's going to have to do with Donald Trump and some pretty bizarre things said by Donald Trump Jr. about, we should never turn the other cheek, and that's just a waste of our time. And that was said at a conference where you would have thought some people would have complained about it. Well, we'll talk about it. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join the conversation last half hour, love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Might give you as a program note the opportunity over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about miracles from time to time, and we've got Craig Keener on tomorrow, and I know we have a couple of other individuals that will be talking about this issue of miracles. Craig Keener will be on with us, of course, on Wednesday, and then we'll be talking about these issues in a few more days with some other guests as well. So I think you're going to find these pretty helpful and useful in terms of ways in which we can think about some of these issues biblically. But let's stay in the political realm for just a little bit longer. This particular piece that actually was put out by AMAC, 7 of the biggest political takeaways from 2021. And it will lead into some other things we're going to say about the fact that Donald Trump is still a major force, even though he is now not even in office, and his son has been as well. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But I thought this was a good way of summarizing some of the things that have taken place. And the first point, of course, is Donald Trump's political career is alive and well, though it seemed unlikely in the early days, he says, of 2021. Former President Donald Trump has returned to center stage, and we will see what happens there. We, of course, are going to be reminded not only today, but tomorrow and the next couple of days about January 6th. But even as you look at some of these straw polls, of course, the question that a lot of people have is what is it going to look certainly 2 years from now? A little premature still. Even thinking about what would happen in the November election of 2022, that is a long way from January to November, and that is an eternity in the political realm, and a lot of things will change, and people that look very successful now won't. And if you were to ask individuals 2 years out from the presidential election last time whether or not they thought Joe Biden had a chance, they'd go, really? I don't even think that's a possibility. And they would have assumed that maybe Bernie Sanders or somebody else might have been the nominee. So, again, lots happened, a lot of water under the bridge, to use an old trite phrase. But nevertheless, his political career is still out there. And you can oftentimes see that most politicians tend to fade pretty quickly. If you were to have thought about the fact that maybe you didn't have the election of, say, Bill Clinton in the 1994 election, but say a little bit 1992 election, but in the 1996 election, whether or not he was then to lose to, say, George W. Bush, and whether he'd come back in 2004, you couldn't even imagine that. If you believe that Barack Obama were to have been defeated in 2016, would he have been able to come back in 2020? I don't think so. So the fact that we're even talking about that says quite a bit about the fact that he's still going to have a dominant presence. Well, let's move on to some others that I think are even more significant. Number 2 was conservatives can win on cultural issues. That has been an assumption that was made 2 decades ago. It's been an assumption that has been completely reversed by almost everybody in the political community that would say today, you don't want to say that you're pro-life. You don't want to talk about family values. People aren't interested in that. We have a much more liberal electorate, a younger electorate. And yet here, the point that this author is making, whose name is, by the way, Seamus Brennan, is that this whole issue of critical race theory became quite a big issue, and he argues that no issue dominated the airwaves in 2021 quite like this issue of critical race theory. I can remember when we would sometimes mention it on the program, and you would get sort of this quizzical look, or what I call the RCA Victor dog look, or a deer in the headlights look kind of look. And yet eventually everybody knows what critical race theory is. And if you have somebody say CRT, they know you mean critical race theory. So it illustrates that sometimes there are really important hot button issues. And a lot of consultants, especially to Republican candidates, have said, just stay away from some of those volatile hot button issues, because because it's not going to work very well. Talk about tax cuts, talk about your concern about children, talk about education, but don't talk about something as controversial as abortion, or as controversial as transgenderism, or as controversial as critical race theory. Guess what? That didn't necessarily pan out this time. Turned out that sometimes an issue can rise to the fore and really dominate an election. Again, governor's election in Virginia, not the same as elections all over the country in 2022, but something worth thinking about. Number 3, just 1 year later, Joe Biden's legislative agenda is dead in the water. Yes, there's still talk about trying to resurrect something like the Build Back Better bill and some of the rest, but a lot of that was shot down by Senator Joe Manchin. If we have time, I want to talk about the incredibly unfair comments, not only about him, but about the voters in West Virginia that we will get to in just a minute. Number 4, Joe Biden and congressional Democrats are just as radical as President Trump warned. We talked about this before. We recognized that when you were hearing that Joe Biden was working with certainly Bernie Sanders and others and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to try to come up with an agenda that would push forward, the so-called moderate Joe Biden tended to be anything but rescinding. Here's a long list, and I won't read all of them. Trump's 1776 commission, reversing the Mexico City policy on abortion, mandating the federal government employees embrace radical gender ideology, canceling the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, undermining the security of the American southern border, of course, the surrender in Afghanistan. You just go down. This list is really quite a long list, which, again, were things that if you had said this time last year, as Joe Biden was going to take office, that this is what's going to happen in 2021, I think you just say, okay, Kirby's kind of lost his mind here. This is not going to happen, and that's exactly what took place. Number 5, Trump's COVID plan was the best path forward. The idea of shutting down the virus, you can't shut down a virus. A virus is going to do what a virus is going to do. All the claims about shutting down the virus, well, we shut down the economy. How's that working for you? But we are recognizing, as I started the program today, with 1 million new cases of COVID. Now, again, this is Omicron, which might be a little less dangerous than some of the other variants, but that shows you that a virus is going to do what a virus is going to do. Number 6, this one's very good, talks about the importance of a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, which was a transformative event. Can you even imagine if you did not have these 3 appointees by Donald Trump? That would be Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. If those 3 appointees were not there, can you even imagine that Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization would even be considered? Can you even imagine that we might actually be predicting that these vaccine mandates may be set aside? Can you even imagine that some of the other things that were actually struck down by the Supreme Court would be taking place? And I think we know exactly what is the case. Now, it isn't necessarily a 6-3 conservative court, despite what a lot of people in the press say. I think it's much more honest to say it's a 3-3-3. Yes, Neil Gorsuch joins the other 2 as the conservatives. We already know who the 2 liberals are. But Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and the Chief Justice John Roberts tend to be the middle 3. Where they go on some of these cases will be interesting, because they will be actually ruling on religious freedom. They'll be ruling on abortion. They'll be ruling on Second Amendment. They may even have to rule on some of these gerrymandering cases, which we'll talk about as well. And then finally, number 7, Democrats have no viable bench of candidates. There is real talk right now as to whether or not Joe Biden will run again, or whether he'll even make it through 4 years. But nobody then assumes that the odds-on nominee a couple of years from now will be the Vice President, Kamala Harris. And there are all sorts of other names that have been put forward. And as we were talking about just the other day with Lathan Watts, you know the presidency is in a little bit of difficulty when, before you've even finished your first year, there is already a list of 11 possible presidential candidates that will be considered 3 years from now. You can't can't even imagine some of that happening when George W. Bush was president, when Barack Obama was president, even with Donald Trump as president. But you have seen that with Joe Biden as president, and it illustrates again that these are some rather dramatic political takeaways. I've summarized this. It goes on for many pages, and if you'd like to read it, it is the last article on our website at pointofview.net. But it did talk a little bit about Donald Trump. And the other day, Donald Trump Jr. spent some time speaking at a group and said some things about Christianity and about turning the other cheek. I thought it'd be worth mentioning, and even concluding by recognizing how if you just want to offend people, how's that working out for you next time you're running for re-election? We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, just sort of odds and ends here to finish off our first day here together live on 2022. Let me again mention that tomorrow we're going to be talking about miracles. Craig Keener is going to be with us. Miracles Today is his book. We also have one with J.P. Moreland on miracles, and two books coming out by two individuals that are very different and looking at the issue a little bit differently that I think would be an encouragement to you. And then we'll get into some other issues in the news. But just before we get into one or two other news items, I did mention Elon Musk. And I thought I might as well just mention this because Elon Musk is, of course, the richest man in the world, apparently. He also has 67, almost 68 million followers on Twitter. Now, you don't want to get into a battle, as we've said before, with a newspaper that buys ink by the barrel. We've said that many times, although that's kind of an archaic reference. But here's another one. You don't want to get involved in a Twitter battle with somebody that has 68 million Twitter followers, and that's Elon Musk. Well, of course, Senator Elizabeth Warren couldn't resist, and so she took him on the other day, and I won't read all the Twitter back and forth, but it is kind of intriguing because then, if nothing else, he responded, and you might remember this from a few days ago, to Elizabeth Warren by saying, "You remind me of when I was a kid and my friend's angry mom would just randomly yell at everyone for no reason. Don't call the manager on me, Senator Karen." Now, I got all sorts of reactions, as you might know, about that. Well, then there was a whole situation about how there were taxes and everything else. And so, again, if you opened your eyes for 2 seconds, you would realize that I will pay more taxes than any American in history this year. He said, did I read that right? I think he said he was going to have to pay $11 billion in taxes. That is a lot of money. And anyway, he said, I'm going to spend pay more in taxes than any other American in history this year. And then he says, don't spend it all at once. Oh, wait, you already did. So, of course, that got her going. And then a couple of others. Interesting enough, Elon Musk did an interview with the Babylon Bee. You can read that in its entirety. But then he just, in that interview, just couldn't necessarily resist. He said, and she doesn't pay taxes, basically, at all, and her salary is paid by the taxpayer, like me. If you could die by irony, she would be dead if irony could kill. And then it went over a little bit for issues as well. And so finally, the last back and forth, I mean, you can read them. They are enlightening and kind of interesting as well. But then I guess there were some ads about the freeloading billionaire who avoids taxes and all the rest. So finally, he just had to at least take one more shot. This is such a deeply messed up lie to the American people. She is the one freeloading off of taxpayers while I'm paying the largest amount of tax of any individual in history. Is Senator Warren really someone we want as a U.S. Senator? So the back and forth between the billionaire Elon Musk and the Senator Elizabeth Warren will be interesting, and we'll try to keep track of it from time to time as well. One other comment real quickly. I always get frustrated by the fact that people tell a story, but they never tell you the rest of the story, and we would like to tell you what has happened. You might remember we did an interview recently with the Attorney General, Ken Paxton. He's the Attorney General of the state of Texas. And one of the concerns he had is that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the Attorney General could no longer prosecute election fraud cases. His concern was some of these district attorneys are less likely to do so, which is why he has a whole section of his attorney general's office to actually prosecute election fraud. And he was really concerned about this and pointed out that he was given that authority approximately 70 years ago. The Supreme Court of Texas had previously ruled consistently with that. And so he is actually now asking the court to reconsider whether or not election fraud can be actually enforced by the Attorney General of the state of Texas. So we'll follow that story, but some of you were concerned that is this going to make election fraud even more likely, for example, in the state of Texas or elsewhere. We'll follow up where that is. Well, just before we finish, I've had some people say, aren't you going to talk about what Donald Jr. said the other day? Now, to give you some context, he was speaking at an event called Turning Point USA. Think very highly of some of the people at Turning Point. But nevertheless, in the midst of this speech, went off on a rant that had nothing to do, I think, with what he was trying to communicate. But he said, we, that is, and he's speaking about conservatives and people in the room, we've been playing T-ball for half a century. while they're playing hardball and cheating. We've turned the other cheek, and I understand sort of the biblical reference. I'm not sure he does, but that's what he said. I understand sort of the biblical reference. I understand the mentality, but it's gotten us nothing. It's gotten us nothing while we ceded ground in every major institution in our country. And so, as one commentator put it, it's sort of saying, well, the Bible, the scriptures have gotten us nothing. It's a manual for suckers. The teachings of Jesus have gotten us nothing. And I think, first of all, I'm not expecting good theology from Donald Jr. Okay, but what about that? The idea of turning the other cheek is we should not be engaged in vengeance or personal retaliation. If you were struck by a Roman soldier, you should turn the other cheek. You should go the second mile. And lest you think that that has been misinterpreted because Jesus didn't mean that, you can go to another passage, and that is in Romans chapter 12, verse 21, which talks about the fact that how do we overcome evil? Well, we overcome evil with what? Good. And so there is, I think, a very strong emphasis on the fact that we as Christians should be civil. We should be gracious. We don't have to be doormats. That doesn't mean that at all. But we are starting to see kind of a different group showing up in some of these different political parties. Maybe tomorrow I'll read what Democrats are saying right now about people in West Virginia, what they're saying about Joe Manchin and the rest. So this is not limited just to the Republican Party. Matter of fact, you see a lot of it in the Democratic Party, but this is sort of this mindset that politics should be practiced ruthlessly, mercilessly, and vengefully. The ends justify the means, and norms and guardrails need to be smashed. Morality and lawfulness must be subordinated to the pursuit of power and self-interest. First of all, I can see why a lot of you say, that's why I just don't like politics, because you've got this kind of mindset, and how can a Christian get involved in the political process? Yet we've had some Christians that have done a very good job of actually being men and women of integrity in the political process. But again, this sort of mindset that turning the other cheek, being gracious, making compelling arguments is something that's going to cause us to lose, I don't agree with, and I think you don't agree with it either. We should be the best examples of civility. And again, I take you back, whether you like what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, how about what Paul said in Romans 12, verse 21? We overcome evil with good. And it tends to be that we like those people that are smash-mouth politicians, but you know what? It tends to turn off as many people as it tends to energize. And I just don't think that's the way we need to be involved in the political process. We'll have more to say about that tomorrow, but I just have had too many people say, aren't you going to say anything about what Donald Trump Jr. said at Turning Point? Okay, you've heard a comment or two. And tomorrow maybe we can get back into that or some of the other things that it is unbelievable what Democrats are saying about their fellow Democrats right now. There is a civil war going on in the Democratic Party. We will talk about that, but we'll postpone that till tomorrow. And then we'll spend some time talking about miracles, because I'm ready to hear from Dr. Craig Keener. What a great speaker, and I think you'll enjoy that as well. And Steve for the help behind the scenes. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.